Welcome to Anonymous Shakespeare, the podcast where we delve into one of literature's most enduring mysteries, the Shakespeare authorship question. I'm your host, bobdub, and together we'll explore the fascinating debate surrounding the true identity of the genius behind the world's most famous plays and sonnets. Throughout this podcast, we'll explore the evidence, theories, and controversies surrounding each candidate, all while maintaining a critical and open-minded approach. Our goal is not to definitively solve the mystery, but rather to foster a deep understanding and appreciation of the rich tapestry of theories that have woven themselves into the fabric of literary history. So, whether you're a seasoned scholar, a curious listener, or somewhere in between, join us as we venture into the labyrinth of the Shakespearean authorship question. But remember, the views expressed in this podcast are those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily reflect a consensus or definitive answer. Now let's just jump into it. Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to Anonymous Shakespeare. Did Shakespeare write Shakespeare? It is Thursday, the 14th of March. It is just past 12:30 here in New Zealand. And joining me today on my quest is Otto X from Navakavada Buddhism. Hello, Otto. Welcome back to the show.
Hello, Roberta. Wonderful to be here as always. Looking forward to tonight's discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. How are you doing over there in cold northern North America?
Well, not all that cold now. It's not as warm as I'd like to be, but, it's not as cold as it could be. We are springing into spring slowly but surely. Unfortunately, that means daylight savings time as well. And that always, of course, is a stressful and disconcerting time filled with cognitive dissonance. But, well, it happens twice a year, and we managed to get through it. So, but that's probably the most exciting thing that's been happening around here.
Well, talking of cognitive dissonance, we have a very interesting article that we're going to be looking at today, which appears to me to be full of cognitive dissonance. So let me just introduce the article. It was kindly suggested last week by one of the viewers. Thank you very much indeed, Ferrex Phasma, for suggesting this fascinating article by George Orwell, which is called Lear, Tolstoy, and the Fool. It's a very interesting summary of Tolstoy's opinion of Shakespeare, followed up by Orwell's opinion of Tolstoy and then Shakespeare. So it's really interesting and in-depth, and I don't know if we're going to get through it all, but it does seem to me, Otto, that part of the conflict in this article is that people are very blinded by their own points of view. It seems to me that we have all these people coming at this one subject from completely opposing sort of worldviews and understandings of language and understandings of culture and goodness and consciousness. What did you think about that? There's interesting people and interesting points of view.
Well, that's interesting you put it that way, because that's actually something that we learned in Buddhism, is that we bring a lot to anything that we perceive. Nobody is a tabula rasa when it comes to these perceptions. So everyone is going to be bringing a lot to the table before they even sit down to, enjoy their Shakespeare. To continue the metaphor, people are going to have different seasonings. They're going to be using different utensils, eating off different sorts of plates. Some people from a wouldn't bowl other people from a slab of bread, which was an old kind of a trencher thing. But so yeah, whenever we our senses encounter and endure anything, including a thought, because the mind is a sense. We are bringing a lot of our own preconceived notions, a lot of the way, we look for special and certain things in what we perceive. It's a sort of a truism, and in the song, man sees what he wants to see and disregards the rest.
Mm-hmm.
This is truer than not. And in this case, I think Orwell makes a very, very good argument that, Tolstoy, when he was looking at Shakespeare, was very much looking at something that reflected his own life situation, particularly in the play of King Lear, and something which he did not like to see. And this also is a truism, and you may have noticed this in life, that very often we dislike people who are like ourselves. Because sometimes we meet people who are like us, but they're like us in ways that we don't particularly like about ourselves, and we spend a lot of time ignoring.
Yes.
And it's harder to ignore when you're seeing somebody else acting it out. And Orwell talks about how Tolstoy made similar life decisions to King Lear in the play, which led to similar consequences of basically being miserable because of his own decisions. And I think Tolstoy felt very uncomfortable with being reminded of some of his, rather unskillful actions, is the nicest way to put it.
Right.
And, of course, he's not to be blamed. No one's really to be blamed as far as that sort of thing goes. You do the best you can. But, he had the sort of personality that had a lot of trouble dealing with that. I mean, I think a more skillful thing a more skillful way to approach it may have been if he'd said something like, well, that was a mistake. Maybe I should, change my course. But he stubbornly, hung on to what he was going to do right to the end of his life. And as Orwell points out, his life even ended arguably similarly to the way Lear's does. So that's one of the big elements about this pamphlet, he calls it. I think it was originally an introduction to a longer work that Tolstoy wrote on the subject.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd never heard of this, by the way. And I'm not a great literateur. I'm not, especially not with the Russians. But and I can see why, because it's one of the weakest things that I've ever read.
Mm-hmm.
By him. I've read some Tolstoy. I've read Karenina. Never got through War and Peace. But I was a little surprised at this, which is like basically polemical mudslinging. I didn't see a single convincing argument there, and it didn't take Orwell. I mean, Orwell pointed out the emptiness of a lot of them.
Yes. Yes.
But yeah, it's just now you've read the article too, I take it. And what did you think of just the idea that Tolstoy was uncomfortable with the Lear character specifically because of his experiences with his children? Having and you're a parent yourself. I'm not, so you've got a further insight on that. There's a special bond and a great deal of emotional energy between parents and children, and this is something Tolstoy might have been afraid to look at.
Well, before I answer that question, we're just going to welcome Roger Hanson live to the mix. Sorry. Sorry for that little break there, Otto. Hello, Roger. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm all right. So are you on the show actually right here and now?
We're right here and now. We started 12:30.
Just getting started.
Getting started.
Okay.
Yes? Do we have our...
Figured you'd get here and I'll jump right in.
So we were just talking about why it was that Tolstoy had decided to focus on King Lear, Roger. And it is fascinating to think that out of all the plays that he could have chosen to rip apart, that he chose this one about a person who was so similar to himself. And another interesting comment that Orwell makes in this article is that he talks about how the theme of King Lear being renunciation, and how later in his life, Tolstoy himself renounced, as you say, he renounced his privilege and wealth and position to live as a peasant and failed. So it's fascinating, though, that before he himself made his big renunciation, he was so against this play, this particular play of Lear, that was, as you say, so similar to him and so similar to his problems with his children and his issues, and strangely, even his death in the end. And I think that Orwell makes the point that people like things because they are things that happen in the world, not because they're made up stories. So when a story parallels situations that happen in the world over and over and over again, people are drawn to that story. So it's interesting to me how Tolstoy was drawn to this story to give his comments about Shakespeare, drawn to the story that was as close to his life as you could get in Shakespeare's writings. It's
like a magnet.
Yeah, it's a strange comment on the human condition, I think.
Yeah.
And these, yep.
So you wanted me to answer a question? Is that what it was?
Yeah, we were just chatting about Tolstoy.
I was just you asked me like.
What did
She started going off. Yeah.
What did I say?
You kind of lost your way there.
I just wanted to double check.
I was wondering.
So it was great what you said and everything, but I kind of got confused there for a second.
Yeah.
Oh, was I asked you a question?
No, do you really want me to answer any of that?
You just jump in with your opinion. Just think.
Well, like after the last show, I was talking about how when we get together, it was amazing to me because I didn't say cuss words. And like, there's one exception I have to make, and it's when it comes to Tolstoy. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I'll just say this one time, and that's it. Basically, what it comes down to with Tolstoy was he was a dick.
Right.
Okay. And he wasn't a very pleasant person. And a lot of the things that Shakespeare wrote, he did have some points, like there are parts about Shakespeare that are tedious. Like with a lot of it, if you're not aware of like the older English, you're going to have an encyclopedia and a dictionary and every other tool you can find to figure out what it is he's actually saying. So that does get kind of tedious, you know. Mm-hmm. It gets kind of confusing. But the thing about Tolstoy that I disagree with is that I feel that Shakespeare's relate only to art and poetry. You know what I mean? Like when he made that statement where he says that it doesn't relate to art and poetry, I don't understand where he's coming from with that. You know what I mean? Because that's pretty much what it was. And a lot of his arguments, if you look at them and then you go to what we were discussing last week, relate to all of the older criticisms that were made by him, you know. Mm-hmm. So he's a lot of it that he was making his criticisms about was made before by Ben and Samuel Johnson, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Where he was mixing up kings and clowns and stuff like that. So mortals with fairies, and I mean these same criticisms were made. So he's just basically jumping on the bandwagon and adding the same rhetoric that was said before him, And he tried to accuse him of being a plagiarist and stealing stuff. I mean, that's Robert Greene right there. I mean, Robert Greene made the same claims during the time period, and it's just the same rhetoric, in my opinion, of what was being said. He was probably doing it for, fame, to kind of build himself up with a reputation and stuff. Because a lot of the stuff I read that you showed me there was pretty much just the same rhetoric. And I have a real hard time with Tolstoy. Like, even when I read something that has something to do with him, it makes my head just freaking want to explode. I cannot handle Tolstoy. He just, like, I actually tried to read some of his stuff, and while I was doing it, my brain was telling me, please stop reading this,
Right.
Until finally I had to stop.
I would get that way about hate. Yeah, that's
it was like, please just stop.
Don't abuse your poor brain.
But that's my take on it.
There's an interesting comment here from Ferox Phasma, who says that a compilation of Orwell's essays can be found in 2 volumes. The first one, Facing Unpleasant Facts, and the second one, All Art is Propaganda. Now that's interesting, because you're just saying here that you think that Tolstoy was also against art.
Well,
I mean, it's interesting that Orwell says that all art is propaganda.
Orwell definitely has his own idea of, this is an interesting article, and we've been talking about the first part where Orwell is basically, deconstructing, not that it needs very much deconstruction, Tolstoy's objections to Shakespeare, but then we get down to Orwell's version of Shakespeare. And again, now Orwell is basically, I mean, to my mind, he's creating a Shakespeare, just as Tolstoy created a Shakespeare. And, Orwell was a bit of a lefty, shall we say. And I'm looking at it, talking about Shakespeare being not that pleasant a fellow. After all, he would flatter the people in power. Things like that. Translation meaning that Shakespeare wrote heroic characters who were noblemen, or noble women for that matter. And of course, Orwell would expect any such character to be shown as, a blood-sucking leech, or somebody with grinding the face of the starving poor, in a fascistic feudalism that never existed. But so it's, Orwell is writing from his own. He's bringing a lot too. Like we were saying before about, Tolstoy, as Buddhism tells us, brings a lot to what he's thinking about and what he's experiencing. He's looking for certain things. He's ignoring other things. And Orwell is doing the same thing here. He also goes out of his way to make a, what he calls humanism, atheism, basically, and any sort of a spiritual deistic philosophy have to be mutually exclusive. You can only be one or the other. In other words, if you believe in an afterworld, then you have to be completely rejecting of this world. And on the other hand, his argument is that if you don't believe in an afterlife, and this is a common humanist argument, that you therefore you put all of your investment in this world and you live a better life and so forth and so on, and then it's just the black hole. And of course, the trouble with that is that it quickly morphs into, well, if there's only a black hole, all that matters is how well I do, and that should be by any means necessary. Because after all, there's no objective morality. And again, I'm not saying that this is the case, but that this is very often this is the logical extension of these ideas, basically epitomized in the phrase "nothing is true, all is permitted," and that's where Orwell, I think, takes us eventually. He probably would be very horrified by that idea. All of those Fabians would be very horrified by where their ideas took us, but they took us there nonetheless. So, but yeah, Orwell, Shakespeare is also, I think, a bit of a projection of Orwell's idea, kind of like George Bernard Shaw's idea. I don't know, Bob, if you had a chance to look at those videos I sent you a link to.
Unfortunately, not yet. No.
Oh yeah, I'll make sure you get a link to, Roger. Basically, a wonderful thing done by the Encyclopedia Britannica, based on George Bernard Shaw's ideas about Shakespeare plays, and he talks about Shaw's idea of Shakespeare, and it's a very interesting one. But all three Shakespeares are completely different. Shakespeare. It's good we use that a logo with like a question mark over his face, because Shakespeare is one of those things that we project so much onto. He's sort of like the cloud images we look up into the sky. And you can see all the different shapes and stuff in the cloud. Everybody sees a little something different. Tolstoy had a Shakespeare, Orwell had a Shakespeare, George Bernard Shaw had a Shakespeare. We all have our own Shakespeare. And perhaps we get the Shakespeare we deserve. Certainly Tolstoy did.
Yes, indeed. Well, we have a very interesting stream today because we have another guest who's just joined us, somebody who hasn't joined us before. So welcome to Mark Edworthy. Hello, lovely to have you with us, Mark.
Hi.
Hello.
So, Mark, we've just started off. We're having a chat about this interesting article written by George Orwell about Tolstoy and Tolstoy's opinion of Shakespeare. And Roger started off saying that, in his opinion, Tolstoy was a dick. What is your opinion of that?
A dick. I don't know what to say about that one.
Welcome to the show.
Sorry, Mark. Sorry.
You thought it was going to be a boring show, didn't you?
I think, Roger, I think you need to explain yourself a bit.
Well, I already did.
He did.
You just go off that.
I didn't know. Yeah,
no, unfortunately.
Well, I can kind of give you a brief breakdown of it. Like, Tolstoy was a real rigid person. You know what I mean? A lot of his ways of thinking and his opinions were really, really rigid. That's the basic way I can say it.
Give us an example.
So,
Yeah,
and that's what I was basically going for there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you need to, give us an example.
Well, like with the way he freaking writes, for one thing, man, you just sit there and you read his stuff. And it was like I was telling these guys, man, I tried to read as much as Tolstoy as I could. But while I'm reading it, my brain is just telling me, please stop doing this. This hurts. You know what I mean? So
it's interesting that in this article that George Orwell is commenting on, Orwell says that one of his first arguments with Tolstoy's writing is that he feels that Tolstoy describes Shakespeare as a bad writer. And he says that's something that is demonstrably untrue. But then, having said that he thinks it's demonstrably untrue, he then goes to say that what is a good or bad writer? Surely there's no actual definition of it. But if something stands the test of time, you can assume that was good writing. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah.
I was just about to say, define what is bad. Bad is one of those words that could mean anything to anybody. But if a piece of text survives for let's say 100 plus years, then it must be of good in some respect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And let me throw something in about Tolstoy. I think one of Orwell's points is about Tolstoy. This is getting back to like his rigidity and his dickiness. Let's not go further, please. And he was a renunciate, like King Lear. That was one of the things about the article, which you probably haven't had a chance to read. But Tolstoy hated Shakespeare, and I was saying earlier, I had never heard of this pamphlet by him before, and I can see why. It is one of the weakest things I've ever seen the author of Anna Karenina write. I mean, I can't believe that anyone would even take this thing seriously, because he doesn't give any good reasons why Shakespeare is bad, except that he doesn't like Shakespeare, and nobody else should like Shakespeare, and everyone else in the whole world is wrong. And this is part of, I think, what Roger is talking about. This was just Tolstoy's attitude in life. He was like this with everyone and everything, apparently. But one of the things that he did was he decided a renunciate.
Shakespeare was equivalent at Tolstoy's time, as let's say Trump would be today in certain societies.
Well, yeah, he had Shakespeare derangement syndrome. Definitely, he was like, he was, and Orwell's idea is that just basically, and he focused on the play of King Lear, because he found King Lear to be very similar to Tolstoy's actual life. Because King Lear is a guy who gives up everything, gives up his land, gives up his power, and then expects everyone to be nice to him. And that's what Tolstoy did. He gave up his titles, his power, his land. He was going to go live like a peasant. He was still hitting people, and he was still screaming at them like he was like, a count or something. And they were still serfs, because he couldn't. And he was miserable doing that. But he did it because he thought he would be happy. And Orwell's point is, if you're going to serve people, you have to serve people, not serve yourself by serving people, saying, "Oh, I'm going to be a renunciate, and then God will like me, and I'll even be happier." And but Tolstoy just had this dog in the manger attitude. At least that's how Orwell analyzes this, and I don't disagree. Reading this, it's one of the pettiest attacks. You can read the article when you get a chance. And again, I'm like reading this, and I'm like, how could an intelligent man write this down and allow other people? I would cringe if I presented this as my best evidences and arguments to establish a proposition. Because it's all basically, I don't like him and you shouldn't either. And the whole world even talks about mass psychosis, shades of fake news. It's like, well, people should really think the economy is booming. They don't, because they're just thinking wrong, stuff like that. And so, yeah, but that's catching up on Tolstoy as and to be fair, let's say the other half of it is a lot of these creative types, they're not all that pretty to see up close. It's like, I like the paintings of Van Gogh or Van Gogh or however you pronounce him, but you really want a guy who's having like sword duels and getting drunk and playing with guns with kids and having ears chopped off. And, you don't want that guy in your living room. Or Dr. Hunter S. Thompson. I love Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, but you want this guy discharging Magnum firearms in your ceiling when bats are swooping, or, coming home in the middle of the night loaded on acid and coke and stuff. It's fun to read about, but I'm an old guy. I like to get my sleep at night. So
agreed.
A lot of these guys can be real true.
The one thing I'd like to add to that too is if you pay attention to what's being written there too, I would personally say that Tolstoy was irritated by the fool in the play. That annoyed him. He was very irritated by that. He was more annoyed by the fool than the actual play.
That's really fascinating. That was one of the things that I thought when I was reading Orwell's summary of Tolstoy's objections, was that it sounded to me like Tolstoy just didn't get English. He didn't get English. He didn't get the culture. He didn't get what the language was doing. He didn't get this type of entertainment of the rowdy masses. He couldn't get his head around the upper classes and the lower classes all being portrayed on stage together in this sort of chaotic, rambunctious way, which is what people love about Shakespeare's plays. is that it's as if it's like, it's as if it's a shot of just real life in the streets with no literary adornments.
Yeah.
I suppose that's something you could say about the scripts. We've always had this sort of form of satire that we will take the piss out of ourselves as well as the people around us. That's just a British thing, I think.
Yes. British humor is a specific thing. There are some people who just do not get British humor, don't you think?
Definitely.
What do you think, Otto, as an American? I mean, I know you are an Anglophile, but what do you think about British humor? And do you think that Shakespeare is a good example of the emergence of British humor?
Well, he was, that was the emergence of so much of what has, basically defined modern English literature. This was the English literary Renaissance. And I think his humor certainly set the stage, and relating to what Roger was saying about the fool, part of that British tradition is the fool, the clown. Shakespeare was full of clowns and fools. Usually they were like clowns or just rustics. Occasionally a full-blown official fool in a few of the plays. And, of course, Lear's Fool is probably the most famous, although as the Fool and As You Like It is also Touchstone. But a fool always had a special privileged position. A fool could say anything and was very often the social critic. And the fool was also immune for attack. And in fact, in Twelfth Night, he goes on about it in detail. Not Twelfth Night, excuse me. And As You Like It in detail, where he talks about how if you rail at a fool, you just make a fool of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
If a fool makes a joke about you, you're supposed to give him a cash tip, in order to show that you don't take it seriously, sort of thing. So a fool was a very privileged position, and you're able to make commentary on your society. And in fact, kings kept the fool so that someone wouldn't be flattering them. It was his job to say to Lear, don't sell your lands, don't be an idiot. You really think these people that are kissing your toes right now when you have power are going to feel very well inclined to you? The guy that made him kiss their toes for the last 50 years, you might be surprised. And he's like, but he didn't listen to his fool that time. And Tolstoy didn't want to listen to his fool, to the people that were giving him a little common sense, saying, you can help poor people, but you don't have to impoverish yourself and go, become a poor person. That's not really, that's more of an ego trip, I think. Really. Mm-hmm. But as far as Shakespeare being, sort of by definition, he's going to be quintessentially British, and I think you can, and probably people have traced some of his stuff right to the later British music hall stage.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, some of the jokes are recycled that long.
Yes, Roger, what do you think about Shakespeare, Tolstoy not understanding the English, the language in which the play was written? Do you think that's part of him hating the fool, is that he didn't understand the culture that the fool was coming out of?
I think the fool represented him, and every time he read that play, he was seeing a bit of him in himself. And with a lot that's been discussed right here in this part, what really sticks out to me is when it was mentioned, Shakespeare's plays have continued to be admired over a long period because they corresponded to the irreligious and unmoral frame of mind of the upper class of his time and ours. Now, when I read that, I've made comments in some of the other episodes too about this. Like, that is so far off base because, the first off, royals and especially the royal family, they didn't go down to the playhouses. That was where they considered the reprobates to be. And if plays were seen by the royals, it was seen in the castle. Okay. Nobles even never went to him. That was where they stayed away from, because that was beneath them in their state of mind. So when he makes when they make this this statement, it's completely unfounded, because that's not the way it was back during that time period. It was, plays were generally performed in the palace where the nobles or the royalty lived. They didn't go to them. So that's the the thing that really throws me off. It makes me think that a lot of this is being written down so that it could help out in the movement for communism during that time. Because Orwell and all of them were all big into that, and they were always wanting to talk bad about royal families and about the upper class and stuff like that. So I can kind of see that. And during this time too, there was a movement that was going on where socialists were attacking older traditions and beliefs that were false, that people believed in the regions. Like you had the the pan something that was in Russia, pan Russian or maybe, but these were old folklores and stuff. Yeah.
Yep.
And
Slavic, racial blood, land, and race, or something like that.
Yeah. Bread,
land.
Blood
and land. Yeah.
Those concepts. 2 points. Remember that Tolstoy died, 5-6 years before the revolution?
Yeah, but come on.
Well, to be fair, that revolution was the fruit of many, many years. I mean,
that's what I mean. Yeah.
I mean, they didn't have a party, as such. This is way before Marxist-Leninism or anything wacky like that. But there were definitely currents that were working towards this. And it was the Fabian Society. These were currents that were working towards things. And when the Russian Revolution did arrive, it was the Fabians that welcomed it with open arms. And you can't really blame them, because they believed in their own paradigm. And, they would go on very careful tours of the new Soviet Union, and they'd see happy Potemkin villages and Potemkin factories and so forth, and report this back to the West. But these were things that were being talked about even then. A lot of that's been suppressed. G.K. Chesterton, one of the most popular writers of his day, brilliant man, a great writer, except for his detective stories, has largely been, as they call it, memory hold. He would debate George Bernard Shaw regularly, and the general consensus was he usually got the better of the debates. They were good friends. Chesterton was great at being friends with people he disagreed with, a great trait. I wish more of us had it today. But he was one of the people pointing out, the logical extension of a lot of these ideas that were very popular then, and which have been inculcated into our societies. Our societies have acted on them, and the results have not been uniformly successful. That's not to say that they don't achieve certain things, but it's at the cost of other things. And I think that's something Chesterton always wanted to point out. When you make any change, you might be gaining something, but you're losing other choose to gain and what we choose to lose. But that's a little off the Tolstoy thing.
There's a expression that used to be quite popular in this country, and you don't hear it very much these days. But there's this idea of you have heard of the long march through the institutions. The concept.
Yeah.
This idea stretches back to the Frankfurt School of Philosophy or Culture back in the 50s.
Oh, right. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, about an ideology slowly creeping through public and private sector institutions. We've seen that in the last 15, or actually a lot longer, but evidently in the last 15 years in education, where we've seen the increase of socialist, or extreme socialist viewpoints.
And when you guys, when I was discussing the socialist thing, I really wasn't at that point discussing Tolstoy. Now, you got to also remember that George Orwell was involved in this too, and he was a well-known socialist.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I was getting at in that statement. Was it was more aimed towards George Orwell than it was Tolstoy.
Oh, right. Yeah. Although he was carrying on some of those currents. And of course, Orwell had his own bad experiences with the party and wrote 1984, which was basically, that's a real life criticism of socialism, criticized from within. So I think it's pretty accurate.
It's very, very interesting, I think. You were saying earlier, Otto, you were saying everybody has their own Shakespeare. And I think this is something maybe that I'm really thinking about or coming to with reading this, is that in some ways, I don't feel we're talking about Shakespeare at all. I'm not quite sure what we're talking about, but it seems like Tolstoy is talking about Tolstoy and Orwell is talking about Orwell, and nobody's really talking about Shakespeare.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, in a certain sense, when we talk about Shakespeare, we're talking about ourselves. We've talked about Orwell, Shakespeare, and Tolstoy's and Shaw's, and of course, we all have our Shakespeares. But I'm reminded of Harold Bloom's Shakespeare. Bloom, of course, being probably the leading Shakespeare scholar and English, just basically the last of the great English literary men. I mean, as a critic, last of the great critics. He had his own Shakespeare, and he called himself a bardolater. He actually worshipped Shakespeare. He practically turned it into a religion, and he celebrated the resurrection of Sir John Falstaff in that wonderful bit in Henry IV where he pretends to be dead and then he pops up again at the battle, and he would celebrate that every year. But he himself had an amazingly personal Shakespeare, and in fact, I've mentioned this to you before, Roberto, about he actually hated the play The Merry Wives of Windsor because he felt that Shakespeare didn't treat Sir John Falstaff properly and failed to accord his character the right kind of dignity. And he considered, he was just crawling to the royals with that one. He created Falstaff into this great anti-hero, this pacifist, this man that looked war in the eye and spat at it. And he did make some very interesting points about Falstaff's character. Falstaff's usually seen as the coward, and the prince always called him that, the cruel, cruel prince. Bloom hated the prince, saw a lot more hatred in the prince than I see actually in the play. But he points out about Falstaff that even though Falstaff has always been called a coward and this and that, the fact is that he is a soldier. The fact is that he does go to these wars, is an experienced soldier, and he does in fact lead his men, cannon fodder as they are, damnably as he's misused the king's press, as the phrase was that he did, taking all of that money for the healthy soldiers. He still was a soldier, and he was a soldier who knew that it's better not to fight. And a soldier, though, was not going to take any chances on the battlefield because he wanted to get home again. And a practical soldier who wanted peace because he knew what war was. This was Harold Bloom's Falstaff, anyway. And again, Bloom, who again I think is probably unfortunately passed on not that many years ago, but a guy who was, I think arguably was the best person to talk about any aspect of Shakespeare that existed in the 21st century. He had a very twisted view of Shakespeare. So there's no objectivity when it comes to Shakespeare, even the greatest scholars, and down to each and every one of us. But that's not a bad thing. Part of it is that reflection off that unknown face. Who really was the author of these plays? That picture of the bard with the question mark. Perhaps it's not a question mark, but it's a mirror that Shakespeare holds up in front of us, holding the mirror up to nature, right? Then what, right? So,
Now, one thing that really gets to me too is about with King Lear. It's mentioned in there about how Tolstoy made a lot of these errors and stuff. Now, with the way I'm seeing it, it sounds like Tolstoy really never even read all of it. He probably just skimmed through when he was making his criticisms. That would make more sense, especially when it comes to King, the rant and everything, because I guess there was a statement made where he doesn't clearly describe how he was tired and wanted to retire.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And that tells me that maybe he didn't read the previous part, which clearly mentioned it. You know what I mean? He's just skimming through it and getting annoyed.
Yeah.
Because that's what I do with Tolstoy. I just kind of skim through it. I get my headache, and I'm like, I'm not going to go any further with this crap. I just can't handle it. He really, man. I know, Mark.
If you've got like an antipathy to something you're reading, you're gonna skip over parts. I'm guilty of that myself.
Yeah.
If I'm trying to force myself to read something that, like you're saying, my brain says, "Don't read this." Like we were saying, I know people like that with Hegel. I think, no, this is insane. But you do. Yep. And again, Tolstoy was in that frame of mind where he was being very selective in what he was looking at, and he would probably really there were probably things in Lear that he just didn't want to see because it was hitting too close to home. There's that old saying, home truths. And there were things about Lear's life that were a little too close to his own decisions. And of course, that's one of the things people say when they talk about why do they like Shakespeare. Somebody asked me that once. I remember I was reading Shakespeare. I always have a copy of the complete plays somewhere nearby. And this guy knew. Said, well, why do you read Shakespeare all the time? Why do you like Shakespeare? And I couldn't really answer. I had to think about it for a minute. I'm like, why do I like this stuff? And there I am, like Roger says, I've got like dictionaries and all these things so I can get through. And I'm like just pouring over these books all the time and have been for years. And finally, I had to think about it. And I said, because everything is in there. Everything is in there. We can learn as much from great literature, I think, as we can from experience in the world. And that's the touchstone of what makes it great. Homer's Odyssey, Shakespeare's plays, Moby Dick, and the Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, which I think is going to be held in esteem. From these books, we can learn a lot about ourselves and about life, and we see ourselves reflected in them. And as we grow, like a book like the Book of the New Sun, I read in my late teens. I came back to it in my 30s. I'm reading it now in my 50s. It brings me something new each time. I see the depth of the knowledge that is reflected in it. And the writer doesn't even always have to be conscious of what he's doing. That's another great thing about art. These things are reflected in it. That was part of what Orwell was saying, Shakespeare would have this or that deep thing, but it seems to be scattered through the play. The whole play is a reflection. The whole play is informed by these ideas, and they're presented in a way that's nonverbal a lot of the time. It's almost like a physiological conversation as much as anything else. And I guess that's why I like Shakespeare. That was the best I could come up with.
Yeah,
just something just something that just occurred to me is Tolstoy. Shakespeare compared to Tolstoy, Shakespeare is a lot more accessible, easier to read to the common person, or the average person, and whereas Tolstoy isn't anything from Tolstoy is not a light to read.
No.
You try and finish a War and Peace in the weekend.
No, thank you.
Indeed. Yeah.
Now, when you were talking too, Otto, you know what that reminded me of? It reminds me of when you're watching a really, really good episode of freaking Family Guy and something Peter does pisses you off because you've done that before.
I know that. Yeah. Like, now they all know about me. Okay, we have a couple of comments here from Ferox Phasma.
Right.
So thank you so much for joining in and for commenting. Let me read these comments to the panel. It says, interestingly, Bloom strongly disliked the Harry Potter books. In a
That's true.
Yeah. In a sense, Bloom is to Harry Potter as Tolstoy is to King Lear. If popularity is the litmus test, as Orwell claims, is he wrong about the Harry Potters? And then he says, to be clear, he is meaning Bloom. Was Bloom wrong about the Harry Potters? And then he says,
would argue,
I
would argue that we'd see if Harry Potter is still remembered popular in 100 years' time.
Yeah.
Okay, so Ferox Phasma says here in brackets, maybe this cannot be answered until it is seen whether Harry Potter is praised in a century hence. So
He will be. He will be. I'm so
sorry.
amazed how many people watch and read Harry Potter. I mean, that just blows me out of the water. I mean, really, it does.
I think.
How long has Harry Potter? I keep calling him Potter. Harry Potter. When was the first book written?
Oh, it was a while ago.
Yeah, but it's only within the last 20 years.
Yes.
Yeah, it hasn't been.
Would have been.
Yeah.
Yes.
10 or 15 years, maybe.
Yes.
So,
and more than likely, Harry Potter didn't really become a thing into the films.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's more of a movie thing. I think it'd be interesting to see what the book sales are.
Yes and no. But I mean, the first book of Harry Potter just went like crazy. It went viral. It was, everybody read it. And then the other books that came along, she sort of wrote them with a view to putting them in the screen because the first one had just exploded. So it's very hard to really separate it out, I think.
There are some writers that actually, I think their work is very easily adapted to the screen, conscious or unconscious, and that can help a lot. P.G. Woodhouse's writing was like that, actually, I always found. And of course, he did work a lot in theater. But I actually did read the first Harry Potter book after it had been out for a while. And I was like, all right, well, I'll look. I like fantasy. And I remember reading it and thinking, it's not a bad book at all. I don't see why people are so super excited by it. And I did like the end. I thought the ending had a pleasant twist.
Yes.
But I thought it was, and perhaps, and thinking about it just now, maybe the reason it was so popular is because I found it a very unchallenging book. It was not a challenging book to read. I like a challenging book to read. Book of the New Gene Wolfe. Oh my God. It took me, 3 or 4 readings before I figured out that Severian is not a reliable narrator. What's going on here? But the Harry Potter book was very accessible. It wasn't challenging. Of course, I didn't read any of the other books, but the story was just a story. I kept expecting there to be more plot twists. I guess maybe I read too much detective fiction, but it was
Harry Potter was also aimed the demographic that was aimed at was teenagers anyway. So you don't want anything overly complex, I think.
On a writing aspect, I've actually heard a little bit about that, and it's actually in the story because you got to understand that where the story starts out is very important. And one thing they focused on was the fact that Harry Potter was getting on a train. Now, when you start a story out where that story involves the character getting on a train at the beginning, they've shown that makes a story very successful. And if you recall in the first movie, he was getting on the train. So they they do stuff like that inside of these stories, and it doesn't matter how compelling the writing is or anything like that. They do it according to the plot, and they set it up according to certain ways and make sure that it starts out a certain that. So
what you're saying is the entire, the majority of the books are extremely formulaic.
Yeah,
they've got a certain pattern.
She definitely does. She has him every single year. He goes through the same growing up. I mean, the first book is when he's 13. The second book's when he's 14. He goes to school. He has these adventures at school, and then at the end, everybody goes home for the Christmas break. So the pattern recurs.
I read that she actually stated many years ago that she was influenced by Adrian Moe. That's it. But I Sue Townsend. So I can sort of, and that's very sort of similar, sort of roundabout.
When my children read it, they said the main thing that they said was, "It's exactly like life. That's what happens at school. That's what it's like to be 13. That's what people are like." They were able to enter into it at their level of development. And every single year, she picked up the challenge a bit, and she put more, the evil was more evil. The puzzles were more intricate. So she took her audience, she got her audience on the first book, and then she took them through this coming of age process. Yeah. And every single year there was a book. Yeah, it's very, very, very interesting. Okay.
No, if you want to compare that to another book that's out there that did pretty good, and it was plot based, that's Legally Blonde, and I know a lot of people won't agree with that, but that did really well, and it was for the same reason, because of the plot.
Right. Yes. Well, how really interesting. Okay, we have talked a lot. Okay, so Ferox Basma says he thinks that it was published in 1997. And he also reiterates that the books were huge before the films. Yeah. And I think that was with the...
I was, what I meant is the films aided in the further promotion of the book.
Definitely. Yeah. Very much like Star Wars with all their little characters, their little merchandise.
Leave Star Wars alone.
Let's give Harry Potter that century.
Yes.
I'm inclined to say, I know we're running out of time. I will say one thing, a couple of things. First of all, the books were hugely popular, but the buying public for books is much, much larger now. There was a time when a print run of 10, 20, or 30,000 would be big. Now print runs are easily in the hundreds of thousands or more.
Right.
Millions of books can be sold. So, numbers alone, it's just a bigger market. And so there's that factor. And the other thing is that I read a lot of 19th and early 20th century literature. I'm something of a fiend for Victorian and Edwardian literature. And there are a lot of detective novels and stories and series and children's series and books that were hugely popular, made their authors millionaires in their time. They would have people like, and Dickens is the most known example, but authors would have people waiting in line overnight to see them on lecture tours where they would read from their books. These were the equivalent of people like that, superstars of today with limousines and stuff like that. And they're forgotten. Nobody knows who they are. Nobody knows who any of these people are. So this is like a century and a half later. So it is quite likely that the Harry Potter books, which are excellent books, I think they might very well last with Dr. Dolittle and with Mary Poppins and books like that. But at the same time, they might fade away with, the Water Babies, which is probably a good thing because that was actually kind of a gruesome book if you are familiar with the Water Babies. Or with, a lot of the children's books by Lang or by others. Who reads the Yellow Fairy book anymore? And there's not to mention, some of these detective stories. Yeah, so it just current popularity isn't a measure necessarily of long-term popularity. But Bloom, well, I think Bloom might have been reacting in part to his distaste for the overblownness. They're not bad books. I've only read the first one, to be fair, so I really can't judge the rest of them. But from what I saw, I think it's just as good as any other children's literature I've read. I think what shocked me was that so many adults were going on at great length about it, and they're well enough written. But maybe I just like my work a little more Baroque, personally.
Mm-hmm. Now, wasn't it Orwell, or was it Tolstoy who made that was Orwell in that you had me read about, talking about a craze, or not a craze?
Yes.
How Shakespeare was just a craze. Yeah. Yeah. And that's all it was.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what
but
Tolstoy
now he's
thought. Yeah.
That it's a pretty long craze. I mean,
it's the 1600s.
I think it's cultural baggage by now.
Yeah. So.
Guys, we have run out of time, but I have to read this final sentence and ask you for your opinion as we exit. This is my final question to you. Orwell says Shakespeare had a considerable streak of worldliness in him, and if he'd been forced to take sides in his own play, his sympathies would probably have lain with the fool. But at least he could see the whole issue and treat it as the level of a tragedy. Vice is punished, but virtue is not rewarded. So do you think that is an accurate depiction of Shakespeare from your perspective? Roger, I'll start with you.
I think it's a good perspective for the men who wrote Shakespeare. They all did a good job, and congratulations.
Awesome. Mark, what do you think?
I was just thinking vice would be punished, and vice would be punished, and virtue would be ignored.
Virtue is not rewarded. Yeah.
Again, it's not rewarded. I'm just thinking these days vice is rewarded and virtue is punished. But
that's the modern
I don't know. Back then, obviously there was the sort of Catholic Protestant argument, Anglos, Christian, and Roman Catholic argument. As a looking at it from a sort of Roman Catholic idea, virtue is always rewarded because you will obviously go up there, and vice will always be punished. I don't know. We were in very interesting times back at that point. From the English sort of Christian sort of point of view, anything could be considered as vice. Remember, Protestants didn't like to have fun. There's no joke about Protestants hated fun. Well, yeah. I don't know. Interesting.
Interesting. Otto, what's your thought?
I want to comment that thing about fun. I'm always reminded of the fact that when the Puritans took over the government of England, they banned bear baiting, torturing dogs and bears. But they didn't ban it because it was bad for bears. They banned it because the crowd enjoyed it.
Oh, wow.
They didn't care about the bears and the dogs. They just cared about the crowd having a good time. But I think
just a minor point on that. Sorry, just a minor point on that. Roger was talking about was Roger that was talking about the sort of royalty and the upper classes not going to the theatre, because again, it was another form of fun. And if you are if you're a proper English Protestant, fun, no.
Or if you didn't have your fun, you did it privately at home where no one could see. And, it was all very restrained, and then it was all right. Mark Twain had trouble with his family when he married, because they were all very well, they came from a different background, shall we say, and he was a heavy smoker of cigars and pipes, and they saw cigars and pipe smoking as very, very low class. They did everything they could to get him to quit, and he was miserable. It was the driest part of his life when he was in Buffalo. And but they all took snuff. So they were still taking their nicotine fix. It was simply the way they were doing it in a private way. It wasn't like this ostentatious show. So yeah, that is often the way with that. But getting to the idea of the fool and vice and virtue, I would say that saying that Shakespeare takes the voice of the fool, or would take the side of the fool, I think that's more projection. I think we have to look at Shakespeare or whoever that was, whatever team that might have been, and I think that all the voices can be assigned. I mean, I've seen so many times people say, "Look, one of Shakespeare's characters said this in support of monarchy, so he was a monarchist," or he had a Roman Catholic monk as a character, therefore he was a recusant, a secret Roman Catholic. Or he said this in criticism of religion. He was a secret atheist. And he has his fool make social commentary. He was a social critic. Well, he was a social critic in as much as he was holding the mirror up to nature. But he decried in the article, they're decrying the fact that, well, he can only make these social criticisms hidden away as the fool and just kind of like, not being very forward and strong about it. And what was the one line he said? Shakespeare used many masks, which I thought is very interesting in terms of the authorship question, because I think there are a lot of masks there because there's a lot of voices. And he says how Shakespeare had to say these things through many masks, and he's ignoring completely, and we've talked about before, which was the Elizabethan police state, which routinely arrested and tortured authors they didn't like. I believe Ben Jonson was imprisoned at least 4 times over plays he'd written, and tortured at least once. Then the poor kid, and so forth and so on. So, to criticize whoever wrote the Shakespeare plays for not standing right up there on the stage publicly with his bare face hanging out and saying, "You know what? I think the Queen was wrong about that." When that was all it was. I don't know. Something happened. His head fell off here, somewhere between here and the tower. Don't know how it happened, Marm. But that's okay. It must have been the Vikings or something else like that. Wow. And as far as vice being punished and virtue not rewarded, I think you can see that in Lear in that particular play. That's part of the pathos of it. I think it was Dr. Johnson who hated the way Lear ended. He rewrote it so that it had a happier ending, and Tolstoy apparently really hated the ending too. But part of the power of that play is the fact that in that play you can arguably say that, well, vice is eventually punished, but virtue isn't particularly rewarded. And this is unfortunately often what we experience ourselves in real life. A terrible wrong can be done. The law can swiftly try to punish, or at least to keep it from happening again, but it's not going to bring people back. If anything else, you could use it. Again, we can bring ourselves to Shakespeare. I could see people using it as an argument against capital punishment. I could see people using it as an argument for monarchism, against monarchism, for republicanism. There's so many ways we can look at it, but that phrase is what I get out of it. That yes, this is unfortunately what we often encounter and endure ourselves in life, and that's why this play in particular really touches us. I have a lot of trouble reading Lear personally, and of course it's a very long play, and they usually conflate it. There's 2 versions actually, but we're not going to get. But we're signing off. We're not going to get to the
We are, unfortunately, we do have to sign off. I would just like to thank you guys. Thank you, Otto. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Roger, for being here, for your insight and perspective. It's fantastic that you are prepared to give up your time to investigate this hot topic. And I'd also, while I'm thanking you, I would like to thank you guys who watched, particularly Ferox Phasma, and I am going to leave us with Ferox Phasma's final thought. He's talks about the author of Mary Poppins, P.L. Travers, says that she was reportedly horrified at the film adaptation by Disney, cried at the premiere, according to what he read. So, not the only author in the world who has been maligned.
You know, P.L. Travers would be a fascinating talk, too, because, you know, if you've ever read the Mary Poppins books and watched the movie you can really interpret as being about the Blessed Virgin Mary. It's a very Marianolatry kind of oriented movie. There are arguments for it. I see you making faces, but you know, it's something we could talk about. We don't have time now. But the other aspect of it is, if you read the books, I read all the Travers books during lockdown because I said, I'm going to read these. So I just sat and I did a lot of reading. And I started noticing things and references to this and that. And I'm like, I read about this in Ouspensky. I've read about this in Orage. What's going on here? This is like the work. And I'm reading more and more. And I'm like, there are openly Gurdjieffian concepts being introduced in these books. So I looked her up. She was one of the circle that was around him when he passed on in Paris. She was a very hardcore. She hung out at the Priory. So, yeah, she was very much a Gurdjieffian, and this actually informed her writing of Mary Poppins. I don't know how many people are aware of this. And I mean, it's not overly pronounced, but there are scenes in those books that are, I think parents today, if they actually read them, there's this fun whole thing with Mary Poppins and this giant serpent that, like, I'm not going to go, you might read the book, and maybe it's something we can talk about on another day, but... yeah, just reading that first Mary Poppins books can open your eyes if you've only seen the movie.
Well, guys, we obviously have a lot more discussion in us. So I think we've also got more things in this article to unpack. And there's the things that you've been talking about, George Bernard Shaw. So we will be back again next week. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you, listeners, for being with us. It's great to have you along. Thank you for your involvement and for the comments. Please remember, if you do have any questions or any things that you'd like us to look at in future, don't hesitate to drop it in the comments. Thank you guys for being with us. Thank you, listeners. We will see you again this time next week. But for today, goodbye. So, what do you think? Who was it?